floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our witnesses. Minister Anasangari, is it appropriate Randy Boissonnault remain in the Liberal caucus?
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. As you know, each caucus is the master of its own domain, and I will leave that up to the Liberal caucus to decide.
Do you think it's appropriate he remain in there?
I believe he has taken the right steps to reflect on what's happened, and he is trying to defend his name. So I do believe that he is doing the right thing at the moment.
Okay, Minister Petitpas-Taylor, same question.
Thank you so much for that question, and always good to see you, MP Schmale. To elaborate a bit on what my friend and colleague has indicated, I believe that Randy Boissonnault contributes tremendously to our caucus. He contributes tremendously to what is happening in Western Canada. And again, he has appeared at committee last week and answered a number of questions. Okay. And again, I've appreciated serving with him as a member of Parliament in the class of 2015 and also in Cabinet in 2021.
Committing Indigenous identity fraud is wrong. Sure. Yeah, I'll start with you and then go back to Minister Anasangari.
Intentionally misleading Canadians is wrong.
Same question?
Yes.
Do you think it's harmful as well?
Yes.
Okay. Same question, Minister. Okay, for the record, that was a nod. What do you think? I don't know who to start with now. Minister Anasangari. Do you think the impact of Randy Boissonnault's actions has caused hurt and harm within Indigenous communities?
I think that it's fair to say that there have been a number of Indigenous leaders who have spoken out. And for his part, Mr. Boissonnault has taken responsibility and has apologized. I think the issue of Indigenous identity, and in particularly his case, he is an adoptee, from what I understand, is quite complex. And I believe he's taken the right steps. This is certainly not something that I think anyone should take lightly. He is taking the right measures to ensure that he both ensures healing for those who he may have impacted in a negative way, but at the same time ensures that he is able to clear his name and rebuild the trust that is required in the work that we do.
I was about the same thing as my friend. I believe that Minister Boissonnault, or rather Member Boissonnault, did the right thing, that he appeared before the committee last week. He spent 2 hours asking detailed questions put to him by the committee. Now he's taking the time to reset the clock to once again be able to rectify the situation.
So if we have, and we did have, an Indigenous woman inside the Liberal caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould, she was kicked out of caucus for telling the truth. Now we have a non-Indigenous man who misled on a number of issues, being part of a co-owning a company while still being in caucus, and the list goes on. You heard the testimony, you referenced it. So we have an Indigenous woman that was kicked out for telling the truth. We have one that is misleading and has a cloudy past. How come he still remains in caucus and Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
So we have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Relevance.
Well, on the same point of order, let the record show that Member Carr couldn't even keep a straight face while he was saying that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. As always, I just want to remind members to keep comments relevant to the study at hand. And so I pause it for Mr. Schmale. You have 2 minutes and 9 seconds left.
Well, I trust how you keep time, Chair. So thank you very much. To the question, to the ministers.
I just want to repeat what I said earlier. Mr. Boissonnault has acknowledged the errors that took place. He's talked about his personal identity, the complexity that...
I think there should be an extra step here. Why is he still in caucus? If
Well,
Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit.
No, Mr. Chair, I have a legitimate point of order here. This is no, just
Jaw-dropping, breaking news.
uh,
A legitimate point of order.
Colleagues, we have a point of order. Mr. Carr.
I had to specify it was legitimate in order to ensure that my colleagues across the way were aware. We are still on the same motion we were on last time. Could Mr. Schmale or you perhaps provide some direction on how whether or not a member belongs to a particular political party's caucus is relevant to Indigenous procurement? It's completely legitimate and fair for the member to ask questions about Mr. Boissonnault as it pertains to Indigenous procurement. No one's interrupting him when he chooses to do that. However, asking the ministers to comment on the membership of their political party's caucus and how that pertains to a member is not in any way that I can see relevant to the motion that we've been sent here to discuss. Perhaps you can speak to that, or Mr. Schmale can provide some further explanation.
So I'll just say one thing. So we are doing a study or an update to the barriers to Indigenous economic development. The order that we were given to the committee was that recommitted for the committee for further consideration with a view of studying the economic and anti-reconciliatory barriers posed by fraudulent bids and applications for procurement opportunities set aside for Indigenous businesses, including those from non-Indigenous owned companies. So just want to remind members of that and as much as possible to keep your questions and comments relevant to the study that's at hand. But with that, Mr. Schmale, you have a little bit more than a minute and a half to go.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that question in a second here. Minister Petitpas-Taylor, this is not the first time you've took over a ministry from Randy Boissonnault. Do you feel uncomfortable doing so this time under the current circumstances?
I don't understand the premise of your question.
Well, that goes to my previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould being removed from caucus, but Randy Boissonnault still remaining in caucus. I think this raises some pretty significant concerns. The fact that, again, he co-owned a company, was still bidding on contract. They checked a box claiming Indigenous ownership, trying to access Indigenous contracts set aside specifically for Indigenous-owned business. We just have 1,100 companies that were removed from the registry. So now you're coming into a role, not the first time you've taken over for a ministry for Minister Boissonnault. Under these circumstances, this cloud that surrounds Minister Boissonnault, it can't be overly comfortable walking into that office now.
Well, first and foremost, I think that's the question that you'd have to ask MP Boissonnault with respect to his dealings. I'm feeling comfortable getting briefed up on a new file that I've just taken over in the past 2 weeks. And again, my officials have been very helpful in helping me get up to date on the files.
My previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was removed, Randy Boissonnault stays. How do we...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Can you provide some direction to the committee, please, on the relevance and the connection between a former member of Parliament, their membership within the Liberal caucus, and the motion that we were sent here to discuss as it pertains to Indigenous procurement?
The barriers to economic barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities. I'm speaking to this because he Randy Boissonnault co-owned a company that claimed Indigenous status when in fact they were not. That, to me, is a barrier to economic development. So let's talk about it.
Not the membership in caucus.
So let's talk about it.
So,
Stay on track.
Very quickly, final question, and your time is just about up.
Okay, that was my question. Why?
That's a question that you'd have to refer to MP Boissonnault, and I think he was here last week for 2 hours to answer many of your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schmale, we're for 5 minutes.
Minister Anandasangri, it's good to see you here. You made a couple statements about Indigenous identity in your opening. You said that indigeneity is personal and complex. You also said that Indigenous identity is defined by the communities themselves. I would just observe that these statements are somewhat contradictory. Either indigeneity is personal, that is, it's up to the individual to define whether or not they're Indigenous, or it is defined by the community. And if it's defined by the community, then an individual ought not just say, I'm Indigenous on their own. But if it's personal and complex, then that opens up more space for self-identification on varying grounds. So I wonder if you can reconcile that contradiction and tell us, do you think Indigenous identity is more defined by the individual who decides how they want to identify, or if it's more defined by the community that says yes or no, this person is Indigenous?
Thank you, Mr. Genius, and good to see you again, and good to be in a committee room with you. Look, I don't think they're mutually incompatible. In a sense of collective identity, when we talk about collectivities, I do believe communities should be defining what that collectivity looks like and is, and the historical formation of that collectivity over generations and in some cases millennia. The distinction sometimes does come to the individual. So, for example, if you speak to Mohawks in Ontario, they will fiercely say the issues around identity is strictly up to the individual nation to define what citizenship looks like. It is not up to the federal government in this case to be. So they're saying that it's up to the nation. Yeah, if I may just finish, because I think you asked a very critical question.
Just briefly, though, please.
And I do want to give you a wholesome answer, okay? So I do think in that case it is that collectivity that defines who their citizens are. That's the way it should be.
Okay.
With respect to the individual, in a situation, if you look at the history of issues around residential schools, on child welfare systems, where someone's identity has, for many reasons, for a myriad of reasons, been compounded by the fact that they may not be living with their biological parents or living in a community where they would have been born and they have long lineage, or they can trace long lineage. I do think it's legitimate for an individual to be contemplating and to understand what that identity looks like.
Okay, I have limited time, so I think I understand where you're going with this, but in those cases, you've got an individual that's seeking information about their own history, their heritage that they've been separated from. It's still the community that defines that identity. It's just that an individual has been separated from that community. This question is at the heart of a lot of this issue, because you have now a lot of people popping up trying to take advantage of government programs who don't have connections to any kind of community. And I was struck by your comment that the Randy Boissonnault case is complex. I don't think it's complex at all. I think it's very simple. What do you think is complex on these identity issues about Randy Boissonnault's previous claims around Indigenous identity? What's complex there?
Well, to me, first and foremost, one of the things that I've contemplated on this issue is that he was adopted. So he was not from his biological family unit.
I just say on that just quickly though, he claimed to be a non-status adopted Cree, and Ms. Idlout asked him what Cree nation, and he couldn't answer that question. His family's not Cree. His family is Métis, and the rules around membership in the Métis community are very clear, and they don't apply to him. So it's not actually complex. I mean, he has. I just don't. Why do you think it's complex?
Sorry, Mr. Genuis, there's a point of order. Mr. Batiste?
I think that Mr. Genuis's comment there that says the Métis is very clear is an inaccurate assessment.
That's obviously not a point of order. Use your own round if you think what I say is inaccurate. Come on. You know the rules.
If he says it's simple, it's offensive to Indigenous people around Canada that he would think this is that indigeneity is a complex thing. In his very question, he talks about.
Can we just get past the feigned outrage? The Métis Nation of Alberta has a clear sense of who they are.
There's too much
on the same point of order.
Crosstalk happening here. So, Mr. Batiste, this is not a point of order. I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuis. You have about 45 seconds.
I would just ask to be respectful of his language towards Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And their criteria for defining themselves.
Okay, can I just speak on the same point of order, Mr. Chair? The Métis Nation of Alberta know who they are, and they have been clear about who they are, and they have been clear that they get to decide, and that Randy Boissonnault is not Indigenous.
So, look, there's a lot of.
We're going to hear from them very soon. It doesn't apply to Randy Boissonnault.
So do you know?
It's not complex. It doesn't apply to
Mr.
Boissonnault.
Batiste, Mr. Batiste, right now, Mr. Genuous has the floor. He has about 45 seconds left. There will be.
Be respectful.
I agree. All members need to be respectful. I know this is a very, very charged subject, and there will be another round for questions from the Liberal Party and comments. But I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuous for about 40 seconds.
Yeah, just to really drill down on this, Mr. Anasagri, and then I'll give you the floor to wrap up. But Mr. Boissonnault said he was non-status adopted Cree. He claimed to come up with that term in conversation with an Indigenous researcher. The Indigenous researcher said no, he didn't give him that term. And you and Mr. Batiste and others want to say that this is complex. He's a member of your caucus, and he just lied about who he was for political advantage. I don't think it's complex at all. Why do you maintain that it's complex? And if so, why is it complex?
There's a point of order, Mr. Hanley.
Again, please respect for the member, and the accusation of lying, I think, is inappropriate.
It's not against the rules to tell the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanley.
Let's answer the question.
Do want to remind all members to be respectful, and with Standing Order 18 speaks specifically to that. With that, time is very short. If Mr. Genuous could get to his question, and then we'll moving on to the next speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to ask it a few times. Love to hear from Minister Anasagri again. Why is it complex? It's not complex, it's simple. But why do you think it's complex? In the case of Mr. Boissonnault specifically.
Mr. Genius, I believe I've answered that question. We can agree to disagree on this. It is not that straightforward for someone who was adopted into a family. The issue of identity is complex to start off with, but in this particular case, I think it's compounded by the fact that he was adopted. I think he's spoken for himself. I'm not here to add to that. I think he's given you his position. As far as I'm concerned, if you disagree with my analysis of this, we can agree to disagree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuous. Ms. Idlout for 2.5 minutes.
I think that the line of questioning asked by the Conservatives are very relevant. I have a friend, MP Rachel Blaney, who's always said she's white, who in a funny newspaper article introduced the article by saying she was born as white, she's still white, but she was adopted by a First Nations family. She's kept it very simple. She's made it very clear that she is not Indigenous. She's never used her identity as being adopted by a First Nations family to make any claim of cultural benefit for herself. So to me, it's very clear. My friend Blake Desjardins also has said, quote, "Everyone who claims Indigenous ancestry should be clear and direct when asked, especially when attempting to profit off of programs made for Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses." Having shown how simple this is, and it is clear to me that the Liberal complacency on this identity issue is creating economic barriers to Indigenous peoples. So my question to both of you is, what will you do to eliminate such economic barriers to remove these barriers to economic development?
Thank you for those comments. And look, I've been to Ms. Blaney's writing, and I've met with members of her First Nation community, and I also appreciate the advocacy that and the work she does, and the same thing with Mr. Desjardins. I think we need to do better, and we need to ensure that first and foremost, the Indigenous Business Directory should be very much led and controlled by Indigenous people. I think we need to find a mechanism to do that, which starts off often with some deep consultations and co-development. And I believe, and although it's Ms. Haidu's portfolio, I do believe that we need to get to an element or towards self-determination. The work that I do, I often say it's about self-determination, and this should be no different. Fundamentally, it should be something that's very much driven
If you
by
could
Indigenous
please
people.
answer my question about how you're going to use pretendians that are creating barriers to economic development. What will you do to address that?
Well,
Sorry,
I think
we're over time, so just very briefly, Mr. Minister.
I mean, for me, the starting point is to ensure that the identification is driven by Indigenous people and not by the federal government. And I think that's the transformative piece where the self-determination comes from, in this case, would be the distinctions-based individuals or groups that form the business directory or inform how the business directory is managed.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Moving next to Mr. Schmale for 5 minutes.
Thank you again to our witnesses. I want to pick up on somewhat where we left off when we talked about earlier that Indigenous claiming Indigenous identity and it being fraudulent is wrong and harmful. I think we all agreed on that. So how does the government recover from the damage done within Indigenous communities after that?
Mr. Schmale, I think the work, first of all, let me just speak about what Randy needs to do and what he's committed to doing. From what my understanding is that he is acknowledged and apologized for the errors, and he's also committed to meeting with Indigenous people and leaders in order to ensure that he's able to rebuild trust. I think it's a personal responsibility he's taken. From a government perspective, I want to just talk about, I think there are a number of issues that have come up, both, I think from a process perspective, but ultimately about how the government put in a directory that is not self-determined by Indigenous people, and I believe that is the starting point for this conversation. And then I think we need to do greater work around the review, how what's constituted, what the partnership looks like, because it is ultimately Indigenous people that need to determine who are Indigenous businesses and who should be qualifying for procurement. So I believe that is the path that we need to take, and it can't happen overnight. But in the meantime, we need to have some significant safeguards to ensure that Indigenous identity concerns are addressed immediately while we develop a longer-term system.
So, given the fact that 1,100 fake Indigenous businesses were removed from the registry, we have the Shannon Matabawaban from the NACA organization, the executive director, saying upwards of 70% of the listed businesses on that directory are not Indigenous owned. What other concrete steps has been taken to ensure this registry actually is true?
I believe Minister Haidu has answered those questions. It is very much in her purview, but I will just add that the actual thinking around Indigenous procurement and ensuring that there's 5% Indigenous procurement, I think it's absolutely necessary. I think how we get there is where I think we need to do better, and in ensuring especially that those who are eligible for contracts are in fact do qualify under the current procurement mandates that exist. If we need to tighten those mandates, if we need to improve, if that 51% need to come to 60 or 65%, maybe that's a conversation that we need to have, but we need to have it in conjunction with Indigenous people. And I believe the government is very committed. We're very committed to moving forward to ensure that we do far better on this issue, with the absolute determination that we need to increase procurement towards Indigenous businesses.
Yeah, the registry still is not solid. We have one Indigenous organization after another saying it isn't solid. And given the fact that your portfolio, to large extent is in the name, right? Crown Indigenous Relations. You're the one sent in to, aside from negotiating and other things, but to make sure that relationship remains solid and strong. It's got to make you uncomfortable that Randy Boissonnault is still in caucus. You're the one managing the relationships.
Point of order, Mr.
We have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Just coming back to this piece of relevance around caucus, I don't believe I saw that anywhere in the House instruction on the motion, but if we are going to go there, perhaps we can talk about why Karen Vecchio's not the chair of Status of Women anymore. Arnold Viersen was removed from this particular committee.
Now we're going on. This is a bit...
Mr. O'Toole was removed from their caucus. Maybe we can start to talk about why that is.
Mr. Carr, I think you've made your point about the relevance here, and are getting off of the relevance as well. The same point, I do again want to remind members the study at hand on barriers to Indigenous economic development, and the order which is on the procurement side and the anti-reconciliatory impacts of non-Indigenous businesses as well. But with that, I will hand the floor back over to Mr. Smale for about 45 seconds.
Chair, just a point of order quickly before we reach on the same point of order, because this keeps coming up, and it might be uncomfortable for Mr. Carr's Liberal caucus. We're talking about a case of Indigenous identity fraud. We're talking to the minister who's responsible for the government's efforts on reconciliation, and it obviously impacts those reconciliation efforts when you have a member of the Liberal caucus who engaged in Indigenous identity fraud, and his company falsely represented themselves as Indigenous in order to try to get government contracts, and he remains in the Liberal caucus. That's very different from questions about committee assignments, etc. I mean, I'm happy not to talk about it if you didn't bring it up, Mr. Carr, and I know this is an uncomfortable subject for you, and you probably have feelings about Mr. Boissonnault's Indigenous identity fraud as well.
But, we're getting into a debate here, and let's get back to the matter at hand. Mr. Schmale, the floor is yours. We have about 45 seconds.
Okay, I pose the question to the minister. It says, as the minister responsible for Crown Indigenous Relations, are you comfortable with Randy Boissonnault still being in caucus?
Well, I believe Mr. Boissonnault is taking the right steps in order to I think, work with people that he knows and to gain the trust of Indigenous people. I will leave it to him to clear his name. I think he has been at committee before, and he has answered the questions and concerns posed to him.
Indigenous procurement program, the way it's set up now?
I believe it needs to be better.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schmale. That